Hey, with your evening story channel, I post new interesting stories every day. Subscribe and click the bell to not miss it. Sebastian loved the outdoors, and by the time he was 10 years old, he had explored the area around the forest. He could have gone farther, but his grandmother Vanessa wouldn't let him. They lived on the outskirts of the village. That's why their old house was almost right next to the forest. Sebastian liked to get up at first light and listen to the birds singing and watch the ubiquitous grasshoppers hopping on the lawn in front of their house. Vanessa sometimes grumbled at her grandson for getting up so early, but she did it quietly and almost angrily. Vacations would be sprinkled and you were still trying to run off somewhere. But Sebastian only smiled and did his own thing anyway. The boy had few friends. Most of them sat at home, watching cartoons or playing with New Year's smartphones. And Sebastian had no such luxury, and so he could only ask his summer leisure time outside, fishing, playing ball, picking mushrooms and berries. Try to get bored here. But not only entertainment was filled with his life in the morning to get up with his grandmother hens, to feed the testicles, to collect up to the grass fresh, but tear and tear, not everything in a row, but the one that laying hens like the most. But the most trouble was with the cow. This black and white beauty was very stroppy. Anything wrong starts mooing and beating her hoof like an overseas bison. But the milk she gave, she was a real sweetheart. That's how they lived. Sebastian's parents died in a ship accident. They were geologists traveling all the time. Little Sebastian was almost always with his grandmother, so she became the closest thing he had to a grandmother in the world. Sebastian didn't know his grandfather. Vanessa said he was a gamekeeper. He had been fighting poachers for as long as I could remember. They didn't like William. He was like a bone in their throat, so they took him out quietly from behind. They never found the stranglers, or maybe they weren't really looking. They sent a new gamekeeper from the district, much more cooperative than the old one, and the problem solved itself. The locals remembered William fondly. He was tough but fair, protected the animals, took care of the forest tanks. Sebastian's grandfather must have passed on his love of the forest. Vanessa, of course, tried to moderate the ardor of his grandson, but the forest attracted him like a magnet. At first, in order not to get lost, he took a few ribbons which he tied to the branches of trees as a guide. In such cases, adults usually make notches on trees. But Sebastian's grandmother didn't trust him with an axe. And even if she had, the boy would not spoil the bark of cedar or larch pines. For Sebastian, the trees were alive, like the rich men of a fairy tale. And there weren't 3,300, and 1 billion of them. Maybe even 1 million. Try counting them. Sebastian wasn't afraid of wild animals. No, he wouldn't go into a bear's den to fraternize with a bear, or cross paths with wild boars. But a restless squirrel or a hare, you can even treat them to a crust of bread or a piece of carrot, if you manage to snatch it from the table. But Grandma can't see it yet. The neighbors said, "Oh look, Vanessa will grow a paw at Sebastian that is not good. He's been wandering around in the woods for so long, and everyone at school calls him a woodsman. Why can't he stay home?" Vanessa knew the reason, but she didn't want to voice it out loud. She realized that if Sebastian had parents, everything would be completely different. Meanwhile, Sebastian was gradually expanding his domain in the forest, each time going farther and farther into the forest. At the same time, he never returned home lightly, carrying a crotcheted twig or sweet berry juice. One day, during one of his walks, Sebastian went further than usual. The forest in this area seemed particularly dense and dark, and the boy had to keep looking around. "I don't know why I came all the way out here. I'll never find my way back. What's going to happen to Grandma then? She's old," Sebastian thought with sadness, realizing that he had run out of colorful ribbons for marking the road. Suddenly, about 50 meters away from him, the boy saw a strange pile of branches and leaves. From the side, it looked like an abandoned hunter's hut or a skillfully camouflaged hut. But when Sebastian came closer, he realized that it was not a building at all, but a real helicopter. A wrecked helicopter, of course, but still a helicopter. There was no doubt that it would never take to the air again. And even 10-year-old Sebastian realized it at first sight. The cockpit was covered with needles and last year's leaves. The way the shrubbery had overgrown the crash site. Sebastian realized the crash had happened years ago. Climbing inside, the boy looked around, but he didn't see anything special. There were some papers in the cabin, preserved by time and dampness. At that moment, Sebastian thought of a very interesting idea. What if we make a helicopter into a tent? It's almost complete as it is. Just add a flower on the roof and the shelter is ready. He liked the idea so much that he immediately started to realize it. After about an hour, the helicopter looked like a pile of branches with a single eye in the center, like the entrance to a den. Well, that's better. I have my own headquarters now. Sebastian thought with satisfaction. But when the boy looked at his watch, he realized he had to run home, or his grandmother would really start to worry and put the whole village on its ear. The way back didn't take long, as Sebastian ran almost the whole way. When Vanessa saw her grandson on the doorstep, she shook her hands. "What are you doing, Sebastian?" out of breath and wet, as if someone was chasing you. "Ooh." Sebastian first wanted to tell his grandmother about the helicopter, but then hesitated, deciding to keep it a secret. What if she forbade to go into the woods at all? And then what to do? Since then, Sebastian had his own secret, one that only he knew and no one else. Now, Sebastian went to the forest almost every day, spending time in his hut. Made of helicopter branches, the boy liked to watch through the slit for the animals that were abundantly born around him. Curious hares, roe deer, and squirrels were not afraid of the pile of branches and approached Sebastian's discovery at arm's length. At times, Sebastian even fell asleep in his forest den, cozy, nestled on a bed of power twigs. But one day this habit played a cruel trick on him. And it all began with the fact that one day, while resting in the hut, Sebastian heard someone's muffled footsteps. The boy's skin immediately covered with goosebumps, and his hands trembled treacherously. What if there was a wolf or a bear, scooting into the darkest corner? Sebastian watched the entrance warily. Footsteps sounded closer and closer. Then the shelf swung open and a human figure appeared in the opening. The stranger was breathing heavily. It acted like a hunted animal. From surprise, Sebastian was confused and, without thinking of the consequences, rattled the first thing that came into his head. The boy's phrase made the guest shudder, reminding him once again of who he really was. Benjamin had been walking through the forest for the 5th day in a row, trying to ignore the bloody feet and the hunger that had turned his stomach into a lump. He had escaped with 2 criminals telling him to take his chances and achieve his coveted freedom. And if recidivists were fleeing, long sentences and barbed wire, there was one event scheduled for the following week that I needed to get to at all costs. His ex-fiancée Betty was getting married after betraying her fiancé, languishing behind a high barbed wire fence. Forget it, you dumped her. It's okay. What's there to grieve about now? 5 years is not an eternity. Will it end someday? That's what Benjamin's Barack buddy used to say. But the guy didn't want to wait for eternity, especially when he was serving the sentence for someone else's instead of his own. Not a day passed that Benjamin did not remember that fateful day when Betty asked him to help his father in a very delicate matter. Back then, the lad in love could do anything, and even taking someone. Elsa's guilt on himself turned out to be not a scary thing, but like a childish fun. Only for Benjamin it all ended with a trial and a 5-year sentence. And now, having received news from the outside that Betty was getting married, he decided to escape. Benjamin's associates stayed behind, deciding to go their own way, and he wandered until he came to a huge green wall of grass and leaves. It took Benjamin a few minutes to realize that it was none other than a crashed civil aviation helicopter. Apparently, someone had converted it to their needs, turning it into some sort of hut. Deciding to rest for a while, Benjamin knelt from behind the strip inside. Leaning against the cool metal wall, the boy covered his eyes. Suddenly, from somewhere behind his back, came a creeping child's voice. "Uncle, don't you want to play hide and seek?" Benjamin shuddered in surprise and turned around slowly. Beside him in the helicopter there was a boy of about 10 years old, looking at the guests with eyes wide open with fear. Apparently, the kid had been here much earlier than Benjamin, so he hadn't noticed him in the dark corner. The boys stared at each other for a couple of minutes, after which Benjamin pulled himself together and tried to answer Sebastian's question. "I don't care about hide and seek, buddy. I've been playing for 5 days. Luckily, so far, I've managed to stay uncaught." "Oh, not found." The boys smiled. Sebastian was a smart kid. He noticed the distinctive tag on the strange visitor's jacket right away. He had also heard on the radio that 3 fugitives had escaped from the colony. But this guy didn't look like a bandit at all. His hands were clean and his eyes were kind. When Benjamin felt the boy's appraising gaze on him, he was embarrassed, he must think. "I was a villain, but I'm not," the fugitive thought. The boy hesitated for a moment, then held out his small hand to Benjamin. "My name is Sebastian, and this is my cabin in the woods. And I'm Benjamin." How did the crocodile from the cartoon look? Probably the one about the wizard in the blue helicopter. "Too bad I'm not a wizard. Me, and I don't have a helicopter." But Sebastian's answer to Benjamin wasn't upsetting at all. "I already have a helicopter. All that's left is to learn magic." After these words, they laughed together. The atmosphere of tension and awkwardness went away with itself. Alone. For the first time in the few days since the escape felt cozy and calm. From the outside, they looked like father and son out for a walk in the woods. They were about to light a small fire and bake potatoes in the hall. Yes, only Benjamin did not know that he was an escaped convict who wanted to look into the eyes of his fiancée, who had betrayed him in the most unscrupulous way. "Uncle, you must be hungry. Let me run home and get you something to eat," Sebastian suggested. Benjamin's heart gave an anxious twinge. He realized the boy might bring a chase. But how could those honest eyes, looking at him with childlike directness and naivety, convey that? "I wouldn't say no, my friend. I'd be glad to. Just be careful." "All right." Chuckles, "The woods are no place to walk." "No," Benjamin replied. Sebastian smiled and gave his new acquaintance a thumbs up. "Don't worry, Uncle." Benjamin closed his eyelids and fell into a clammy, restless sleep. He dreamed of a dream. When he was as small as Sebastian and his father had disappeared in the middle of the dense taiga forests. Charles was working for the mines at the time. He was a civilian helicopter pilot, transporting goods and people from one point to another. And then one day Benjamin's father disappeared. The search turned up nothing. Charles was still missing to this day. At that moment, as if some unknown force pulled Benjamin out of his dream state. Where did that helicopter come from? How could he not have thought of it? Opening his eyes, Benjamin frantically examined the fuselage and the crash site. But it was all in vain. He could find no trace of human presence. And when Benjamin already frustratedly waved his hand, he suddenly noticed something strange, something that even Sebastian had not noticed. On a tree branch about 50 meters from the helicopter crash, on the pilot's helmet, and at its foot was a pile of rags and things. Benjamin ran closer and gasped. On the ground was the pilot's duffel bag, and next to it some luggage packed in a thick tarpaulin. Opening the backpack, Benjamin rummaged through it a little, then found a passport, thoughtfully wrapped in transparent polyethylene. Afraid of his own guess, Benjamin tore off the protective covering and opened the document. From a yellowed photograph. Staring back at him was his father, Charles. Tears flowed from Benjamin's eyes. Without wanting to, he had found the site of his father's death, whose remains he had likely buried himself with the help of wild animals and leaves. Here, brushed away a tear, Benjamin carefully opened the tarpaulin roll and marveled. There was gold, lots of gold, nuggets in the sand and small bars. Only now Benjamin realized that many years ago his father had made a delivery of valuable cargo and crashed. Most likely, the flight was bypassing the established flight schedule, which is why no one was looking for the dead pilot. Bosses are always afraid of inspections and investigations, and a shipment of gold may well have been illegal. As they say, mind bypassing the state. Anyway, the fact remained that Benjamin's father was dead. Benjamin's father was dead, and he was at the place of his death. The realization of this made the boy sit up and put his arms around his head and cry quietly. At this very time, a boy named Sebastian was rushing to bring food to his new friend. Unfortunately, neither Sebastian nor Benjamin knew anything about the fact that at the same speed, from the opposite direction, a chase with dogs had been sent on the trail of the fugitive. And time was running out, not even in hours, but in minutes. All this Benjamin did not know. Neither did he know that his former fiancée Betty herself was under investigation after a failed scam, a lucrative marriage. Together with her father, who received a solid sentence for his past deeds, was in the dock. This criminal couple was arrested in a restaurant where father and daughter intended to celebrate the wedding. As fate would have it, Benjamin did not escape retribution either. He was detained exactly at the moment when Sebastian appeared in a clearing with a satchel and provisions in his hands. Looking at the operatives, Benjamin asked for an opportunity to say goodbye to the boy. The search party made no resistance to this. Especially Benjamin was restrained with handcuffs and chains. No one knew exactly what the escaped convict whispered in the boy's ear, but from the way Sebastian's face was changing, the phrase was pleasant and even shocking in places. The most surprising thing was that the gold from the mines was never found. However, the operatives did not know about it, and Benjamin knew how to keep his mouth shut. In total, taking into account the previous sins and misdemeanors, Benjamin had to serve 10 years. When he got out, he saw a fancy SUV with a nice guy in it. Sebastian has not forgotten 20 years, so he is back, thought the former prisoner, and hurried to the guy, whom he remembered as a 10-year-old boy. Then many years ago, anticipating the imminent denouement, Benjamin had hidden the gold and whispered to Sebastian about the stash during a farewell conversation while standing at gunpoint. Sebastian seemed like a clever boy, and having found the gold, did not use it until he came of age. Then, after his grandmother died, he sold part of the treasure and built a farm where the cows and birds could not be counted. Having received a good education, Sebastian established a fund to help former prisoners, homeless, and people in difficult life situations. No one knew the secret of Sebastian's sudden wealth, and only Benjamin, who had been released from prison, understood without words. Embracing Sebastian, the man quietly cried. During all this time, Sebastian supported him in the colony and became like a relative. It all started in a small hut made from that helicopter. Perhaps it still waits for guests in its cozy, cool walls.